We're back for Your Ears Only. I'm David Alpern.
I'm Melissa Exelberth with a quote from the news. Mr. Bloomberg is pretending we're a secular society, and we are not. That was Richard D. Land, president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, on initial exclusion of clergy as speakers at Sunday's 9/11 10th anniversary ceremony at Ground Zero. Now this.
Another one just hit the building. Wow. Another one hit it hard. Another one just hit the World Trade. The whole building just came apart.
Holy smokes. All right, I guess you guys can be busy.
From the mountains to the prairies to the ocean, white with home. God bless America, my home, sweet home.
Air traffic controllers were among the first to realize the tragedy just erupting that sunny September morning 10 years ago, as revealed in recordings and transcripts of their horrified observations finally released last week. By the end of that fateful day, members of Congress displayed dramatic resilience and unity under stress in spontaneous song on the Capitol steps. But physical, emotional, and psychological impact of 9/11 attacks that killed thousands of Americans continue to this day for many around the areas where the hijacked jetliners went down, and for some far beyond, as the most painful evidence of U.S. vulnerability replayed endlessly on TV.
To talk about the psychological impact of 9/11 and the lessons still being learned from it for Your Ears Only, we're joined by an expert on resilience, Dr. Anthony Mancini, assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Pace University, whose Manhattan campus is just blocks from Ground Zero. He was a key participant in a symposium on the impact of 9/11 images in the news media, co-sponsored last week by the university and the National Press Photographers Association. Professor Mancini, welcome to our program.
Pleasure to be here.
The good news of your research is the relatively small percentage in any population who will suffer long, enduring, and disruptive psychological symptoms, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, after direct involvement with a major stress event. Give us the range and the most important factors that will affect it.
That's absolutely correct. What we find in response to 9/11 is that among New Yorkers, if you think of the population as a whole, you find that approximately 6% of New Yorkers in the tri-state area would have qualified for a PTSD diagnosis 6 months after the attack. So that's a relatively small percentage. However, what you find among people who were directly exposed to the event, people who were either in the towers or who lost a loved one, that percentage does increase to 30%. Now, in terms of what helps people, and the most important factors, the degree of exposure is the single most important factor. That is, the degree to which you saw horrendous things, or perhaps you lost somebody, or you were injured yourself. That is going to put you absolutely at greater risk. On the positive side, the thing that is going to be most helpful is a sense of being supported by others. So we know that if you feel that you have someone to talk to, should you want to talk about the event, if you feel that that person is available, then that is an enormously protective factor.
Clearly, watching a traumatic event on TV or the internet is not as threatening as being involved or an eyewitness, as Melissa's mom was on 9/11, as we know from following famines, floods, hurricanes around the world. But the 9/11 attacks were a warning that all Americans could also be targets. What does your research lead you to believe about 9/11's long-distance effects?
Yeah, well, there's no question that 9/11 induced distress and worry and transient post-traumatic stress symptoms across the country and perhaps even the globe. But there really isn't too much evidence that people actually had a post-traumatic stress disorder syndrome at a remote remove from the event itself. So it isn't to say that people weren't disturbed and upset by it, but we don't have. Most people don't believe that kind of exposure is sufficient to result in a syndrome of post-traumatic stress disorder.
What do we know about the psychological impact of traumatic events on children?
Well, children are at equal and some suggest slightly greater risk for post-traumatic stress disorder, but the findings are quite mixed, and there's more controversy, I would say, in the child literature. Children, nevertheless, even if they are at risk, almost all of them will return to their former level of functioning. In other words, like adults, almost all people will return to their former levels of functioning after some time.
Your work has focused on resilience to the impact of trauma. What's the best definition of resilience as opposed to normal recovery over time?
The best way to understand resilience is as a transient and modest elevation of distress in which your equilibrium is not disturbed, you're able to go to work, you're able to see friends, you're able to carry out your daily life, and to experience positive things, positive emotions, pleasure. And so people who are resilient show this pattern. It isn't that they aren't upset, it's just that they're able to go on about their daily lives. People who show a pattern of recovery experience more moderate levels of distress that take longer to subside. And so they take a longer time to get to baseline.
I was interested to read your finding that confidence about one's ability to deal with trauma may in fact undermine that ability. Talk about that.
Yes, this is a very interesting result that I think confirms the notion that we have to take seriously a significant stressor, and we have to mobilize our own coping efforts. And if we don't mobilize those coping efforts, if we underestimate them to too great of an extent, then we are putting ourselves at risk. So on the one hand, we shouldn't think of an event as overwhelming and threatening and something we can't handle. On the other hand, we shouldn't view it as something that should be dismissed or as trivial. We should take the full stock of its gravity, and we should deploy our coping efforts accordingly.
Briefly, you and some colleagues also have warned against widespread use or overuse of some newer psychological intervention techniques after trauma to prevent or minimize future problems, especially a kind of cathartic immediate debriefing. What's the danger?
The danger is real, and the danger is that we interfere with our own natural coping response. And so people should be left to their own devices immediately following a traumatic event. They should be allowed to deal with it in the way that they feel comfortable. For many people, the stiff upper lip strategy is a legitimate one, and it works. And so we shouldn't interfere with that. After some time has elapsed, some people will have persistent distress. And for those people, treatment is an important option. But immediately after an event, people should be allowed to deal with the event in the way that they feel most comfortable.
Dr. Anthony Mancini, an expert on resilience after trauma, is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Pace University, whose Manhattan campus is just blocks from Ground Zero.
Next, a remade Middle East, its pros and cons in the post-9/11 world, for your ears only.